I'm Welton Gaddy. Welcome to State of Belief continuing coverage of the 2020 Republican National Convention. Religious themes have been much more evident at both the Democratic and Republican National Conventions this year. While deployed to different ends, the preponderance of GOP God talk has centered on accusing Democrats of wanting to get rid of God. How has religion played a part in the Trump presidency? Religion News Service national reporter Jack Jenkins has put together a very useful timeline, and I am happy to have him join our coverage today. Jack, thank you for beaming in.
Thank you so much for having me.
Listen, that piece is a really good thing, and we're going to talk about it. You start from the incredible level of white evangelical support for Trump, 81% in the 2016 election.
Right. I mean, that in many ways is the story that has painted the rest of Donald Trump's presidency, right? There was this surprising statistic that came out of the 2016 election that 80 to 81% of white evangelicals who showed up on election day backed Trump. And that surprised quite a few political observers, in part because, these were sort of quote unquote values voters. These were part of the religious right who had for so long championed personal character as something that they sought after in politicians. In fact, we actually have some data to support that just a few years earlier, upwards of 60, 70% white evangelicals said that that's a key and important and crucial thing for a politician to have, is this personal moral character. But then in 2016, when that same question was asked in the same poll, a few years removed, you saw that number flip and reverse. And so this willingness of white evangelicals to back someone like Donald Trump, even after, the Access Hollywood tape broke, that had him bragging about sexual assault, became this interesting dynamic that played out for the rest of his presidency, where you often repeatedly see Trump appealing to this demographic that was so crucial to elevating him to the White House to begin with.
Yeah. It's ironic that the first prominent figure from that world to loudly endorse the Trump candidacy as Jerry Falwell Jr., the son of the founder of the Moral Majority, the first modern attempt to remake American democracy in a fundamentalist image, and a catalyst for the founding of Interfaith Alliance itself. Now, almost cartoonishly disgraced, he won't be much help in the re-election effort. Do you know where white evangelical support for Trump stands right now?
So that is a good and interesting question. To your point, Falwell, as previously noted, has resigned and then unresigned and then resigned again in the last 48 hours from Liberty University. It doesn't seem to be a major player for Trump, which is, it shouldn't be underestimated. I mean, understated. Falwell was pretty crucial to Trump in some previous moments. When after the Charlottesville comments, when Trump referred to both sides, that was so controversial. The White House, when they were asked by media outlets to send someone to kind of defend Trump's comments that he had made, the White House wouldn't send a White House official. They pointed them to Jerry Falwell Jr. So losing him has been this interesting note. Because there have also been signals that the white evangelical support for Trump, while still very much something that Trump enjoys in general, he still has a majority support among white evangelicals. That does seem to be fracturing a bit depending on which poll you look at. Now, Pew Research did kind of a binary poll where they said if you're voting for Joe Biden or for Donald Trump. And they found that roughly 80 to 83% of white evangelicals say that they would back Donald Trump come election day. So that would put within this probability of error, Trump still sitting roughly around the same place he was in 2016. But different polls, particularly those from Data for Progress, when they ask voters more than just Biden or Trump, when they say, or would you not vote, or would you vote for a third party candidate, you see Trump's support slip dramatically. from that sort of 83% statistic I mentioned earlier to only around 61, 62, 63%, with 2.3 saying that they would back a different candidate, 1.4 saying they aren't going to vote at all, and then a 6 to 7% shift of folks who aren't sure yet. And that signals to a lot of people a shift that has occurred underneath Trump's feet, where particularly in light of the coronavirus pandemic, because that same poll, when they ask white evangelicals, hey, do you know someone who has COVID-19? And, someone who has contracted this disease, if people who don't know, people who aren't sure, haven't encountered it in their family or their friends, about 68 to 69% of that population of white evangelicals say they would back Trump in November. But those who know someone who's contracted the disease, that drops back to 60%, a 9-point shift there. And so this is something that Trump is kind of up against between now and November, where, among white evangelicals and many other demographics, the big, while he might be able to appeal to religious freedom or to the idea that faith is under attack here in the United States, things we've seen at this week's RNC, he's going to have a hard time beating back a national pandemic that people will continue to experience. And I'll note that white Catholics are also a very key demographic for Trump that he has to pay attention to, because unlike white evangelicals, while they did back Trump in 2016, their support for him has been significantly more elastic, up and down over the course of his presidency than white evangelicals. And if he lost that demographic and only a little bit of white evangelicals, that could spell a defeat for him come election day.
Jack, you highlight the apparent foot dragging by this president when he's been called upon to condemn attacks on followers of other faiths, anti-Semitism in 2017, the India trip. But I'm also reminded of the coarseness of the Muslim ban. Some see a pattern of willing ignorance. Others, a more sinister one. What do you think?
Well, I think one of the interesting patterns that emerges pretty quick when I was building this timeline is that when Trump talks about religion and when Trump talks about religious freedom, in the latter stages of his presidency, he has started to try to make sure to name check Muslims and Jews and other faiths when he talks about religion. But in terms of who are most interested in his policies, who he often is making policy decisions for, and when it comes to religious groups, he has now become pretty overtly clear that he has done a lot of them for white evangelicals. Just last week, he was speaking to a crowd, Donald Trump was, and said that his decision to move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem in Israel was, quote unquote, for the evangelicals. That he was name checking that as a reason he was doing that, which is why it's also probably not coincidental that last night at the Republican National Convention, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo delivered his speech to the convention from Jerusalem. And there are some allegations that might actually violate some federal laws, the Hatch Act in particular. But the reason that the Trump campaign might want to do that anyway, and why there's this continued appeal to these sorts of issues, is because they play well with one particular religious group, white evangelical Protestants, and some white Christians and Catholic spaces, and others who might also be included in that group. And so it's not, instead of just like in terms of the sinister elements you were talking about, it really seems like a prioritization issue for a lot of people, where Trump is prioritizing the concerns and needs of one specific group of people that put him in office to begin with, and that seems less concerned with other demographics, which for the record may hurt him come election day. For instance, many Muslim Americans saw the travel ban as what he originally promised it would be during his campaign, which was a ban on Muslims entering the United States. And so, Muslim Americans are very well represented in Michigan in particular. They have a sizable population in and around Detroit, Michigan, particularly in Dearborn, Michigan. And that's a state that Trump won by a very narrow margin in 2016. Again, he doesn't have much ground to lose. And so it's totally possible that this prioritization of white evangelicals, while it might have shored up his base, it might have cost him in other demographics that will prove crucial on election day.
Jack, I want to stay with what you were talking about, because just in a little bit, I was going to ask you anyway about your thoughts on Pompeo's speech from Jerusalem. The political message and audience is unmistakable, but there's also so much wrong with this stunt, isn't there? What was your thoughts about that?
I mean, it's important to remember when Trump announced that he was, one, declaring Jerusalem the capital of Israel, and two, that he was moving the U.S. embassy there, the reaction among religious communities was deeply mixed. You had the head of the Union for Reform Judaism, the largest bloc of Jewish Americans in the United States, actually issued a statement after that, saying that they might not disagree with certain parts and principles of what's happening with those decisions, but that they thought that the timing was really bad and actually detrimental to the peace process. You had Christians in Jerusalem issue a joint statement saying that they disapproved of this moving of the U.S. embassy. You had the Pope Francis, speak out against this decision, and any number of Muslim groups here in the United States decried that. And even had Middle Eastern Christians that supposedly were folks that Trump said he was going to prioritize their concerns, saying that this doesn't help the peace process and might actually put us in danger as a result of this decision. But Trump did it anyway. And when they established that embassy in Israel, they had two evangelical pastors, Robert Jeffress, who's a Texas pastor, who's a longtime supporter of Trump, as well as John Hagee, who's head of the Christians United for Israel, this very large group that pushes for Israel, who were the ones who delivered the prayers at this embassy erection in Israel. And so it says a lot about who that's about. And so Pompeo, delivering this speech last night, one, seems to be a pretty overt appeal once again to that demographic. I mean, he called it the city of God, quote unquote, when he was standing there during that video. And of course, the part of that might cost them is that, and I'm actually writing about this now, is that there are allegations that speech violated the Hatch Act, which prohibits federal officials from in the executive branch from essentially engaging in explicit political activity while also operating in their official capacity. There was actually several instances last night that people think might have violated the Hatch Act, including videos of Trump naturalizing U.S. citizens and granting pardons. But again, I think, from the perspective of maybe the Trump campaign or the Trump calculations, it may be that they see that sort of stuff as, it's worth the risk to get blowback from that sort of action, as long as it continues once again to get support from among evangelicals who, as I noted, Trump said he moved that embassy for them, quote unquote.
Yeah. Listen, I've got to ask you, do you have a favorite moment in the greatest hits of religion at play in the Trump presidency?
Well, I wouldn't say favorite. I would say that the one that I think will probably stand the test of time as one of the most dramatic instances of religion and politics is, of course, the Bible photo op in front of St. John's Church. Mm-hmm. And I think what was so interesting about that moment was that the big controversy around it wasn't just the photo op itself. It was the fact that hundreds of peaceful protesters who were in Lafayette Square, which for those who haven't been to D.C. is in between the White House and St. John's Church, were forcibly expelled from that space before he made that jaunt across the park to St. John's. And that included the expulsion of at least one Methodist minister who was among the demonstrators, and a priest and a seminarian who were working at St. John's, giving aid to the demonstrators at the behest of the Episcopal Diocese that oversees St. John's Church. And they were also expelled with gas and batons from the patio of St. John's. And then Trump shows up and holds up a Bible. And what transpired over the next 24 hours was the head of the Episcopal Church and the bishop from that diocese chastising and deeply criticizing the president for having done that. It's essentially legally it's the diocese's church that that they argue he violated by holding up that Bible and taking that photo op. But Trump was able to utilize and expel religious professionals from that house of worship to send a signal not to them, but to white evangelicals who at the time he was slipping in the polls with. And I think for me, there's so many elements of Trump's presidency that are encapsulated in that moment, where, while there might be large disagreements between what the party line in the administration says happened that day and what those who were actually there, in the park say occurred, it seems like it ultimately it's deeply symbolic, not necessarily of what Trump maybe wanted it to symbolize, which is this, I guess, appeal to religion, but more rather, I think that there is a prioritization of one religious community in particular over and against other religious Americans in the United States by this president.
I don't know how closely you've been able to watch the conventions, Jack, but I would love to hear your thoughts about the presence and purpose of religious language in both gatherings.
Yeah, so I think what's interesting is that these are probably the most overtly religious conventions in recent memory with either party. And I mean that without qualifying. I think the Democratic convention that happened last week was probably the most overtly religious convention in recent memory of either party. And now Republicans have also tried to one-up Democrats in that same appeal. What's interesting is how different the appeals to religion are. At the Democratic National Convention, a lot of the appeals to faith were, one, generally speaking about how faith is valued, but also very specifically talking about Joe Biden as a person of faith. You had speaker after speaker, Michelle Obama, Nancy Pelosi, Senator Chris Coons discuss at length or even Joe Biden, Joe Biden's wife, refer to Joe Biden as a man of faith, a person of faith, a person who takes his Catholicism very seriously. And, kind of, lifting this up as this idea, hey, this is a person for whom religion is something he holds close to his heart, referencing the fact that he walks around with a rosary that belonged to his late son, Beau. And I think part of that is because Joe Biden has been relatively consistent over the course of his political career, his long political career, with not shying away from mentioning his faith when talking in a political, in a capacity as a politician. He's been very clear about wanting to separate church and state, but his faith is a part of his political persona and has been consistent on that. I also think it's notable that the Democratic National Convention is one of the only times between now and November that the Democrats are going to be able to kind of make a pitch to the national audience. And that's because in the midst of a pandemic, traditional field campaigns can't occur right now. Traditional, rallies where, Biden might go to Youngstown, Ohio to talk to Rust Belt voters. That can't really happen the same way it did 4 years ago or in any other election cycle since, 1918. And so this is the big pitch they have to the nation. And so instead of kind of being more red meat among Democrats and liberals and progressives, the Democratic National Convention did feel fairly well suited to a swing voter, someone who might be, introducing Biden to them, not for the first time, but as a presidential candidate for the first time. And so that appeal to faith probably played really well, appealing to the better angels of faith as this uplifting, inspiring, conciliatory faith that was modeled as something that could be beneficial during a pandemic of which there is so much death. That was the kind of faith that was appealed to in the Democratic National Convention that could play well with some of these, white working class Catholic voters and Christian voters in the Rust Belt. By contrast, the Republican National Convention has been, the hallmark so far. There have been ample mentions of faith, but often as if it were something that were under siege, as something that is under threat, that faith is something that people do not respect, that Democrats are trying to take from Republicans, as it were. We've had multiple speakers make this claim that Democratic governors will let you worship, but they'll let people protest, which isn't entirely true. Nor is it at all true that religious people uniformly want to worship together in person. There's actually some of the loudest voices calling for people to avoid in-person worship have actually been people of faith who were concerned about their parishioners contracting disease. But this is the tenor of this convention among Republicans is to frame religion as a thing, and specifically Christianity in particular, as something that is one, uniquely the purview of Republicans, and two, something that Democrats are trying to take away from those. I think it's notable that the Republican National Convention opened up with a prayer from a man who appeared to be a lay Catholic, with him making this appeal, heavily implying that Democrats themselves are not have moved away from religion. And unlike the Democratic National Convention, which repeatedly invoked Biden's faith, he said, we're all sinners and we're all on a journey to faith. And so we should think about Trump's faith as a journey, something that he is on. And I think that's a key difference between Biden and Trump, is that Trump is going to have a harder time appealing to a lot of these swing voters as someone who is, seen as pious or deeply devout. Instead, he will be seen as a protector of religious liberty and or Christianity in particular. At least that's how he's being framed, even if he's not necessarily the most devout person himself.
Do you think religion will stay prominent until Election Day, or is it going to fade during the fights?
Well, I think it'll probably stick around. It's very clear that the Democrats see this as something that they want to lean into. I would argue part of that's because Trump has invited the contrast. When he made the comment that Biden is trying to hurt God and hurt the Bible, people in the Biden camp, when I was doing reporting, kind of expressed like that they enjoyed that juxtaposition. They think that they only benefit from Trump trying to draw that contrast, because they think if Biden's going toe to toe with Trump about who would be able to cite scripture, who would be able to talk about faith in depth, that Biden would win that fight. And so that's something that they're willing to lean into as a point of contrast. And since Trump also did that photo op of him standing in front of that church, which, while celebrated by some evangelical leaders, was decried by many others, including some conservative Christians. And so I think there's a reason why you will continue to see Democrats in particular lift up faith as a point of contrast with Trump, to try to imply that Joe Biden is morally superior, or at least belongs to something that looks more like the faith that many Americans were reared with and that they've heard preached from their various pulpits. Now, in Trump, I would be surprised if he pivoted off of the kind of way that he's invoked faith for the last 3.5 years, which is invoking it as a way to appeal to white evangelicals, saying that he's going to protect them, that he will be, as some have described, the bully on behalf of conservative Christians who are seen as this beleaguered, besieged minority by many within the religious right. So I don't see religion going away between now and November, particularly not in like the smaller events that we will see that Democrats will hold on Zoom and in their advertisements. It's very clear that groups like the Lincoln Project, which has put out some really scathing ads, it's run by Republicans. They've now entered into a partnership with Vote Common Good, which is this more liberal religious group that's, they're going to be crafting projects together. I know several other organizations, more liberal Christian organizations, are also gearing up to try to put out ads and make efforts between now and Election Day. Also, many groups of other faiths, Muslim groups, et cetera, who are trying to make sure that they touch on their demographics and their voters between now and November. So I don't see this going away. The one thing that might change between now and November is if we do get debates, and if they do ask a religious question between Trump and Biden. I am curious about how the two attempt to dialogue about religion. And I think that's something me and many other religion journalists will be watching closely to see how each tries to message a question about religion.
Jack Jenkins is national reporter at Religion News Service and the author of American Prophets, The Religious Roots of Progressive Politics and the Ongoing Fight for the Soul of the Country. Jack, thanks so much for being with us today. I always learn from you and enjoy hearing your perspective, and that you saying religion is going to stay with us the whole way. We are going to be needing to talk with you again, I know. And we will look forward to doing that.
Well, I always appreciate coming on. Thank you so much for having me.
And friends, look for more of our convention coverage, including interviews with leaders, activists, and delegates all week at stateofbelief.com. I'm Welton Gaddy. Thanks for watching.